The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other. I was reviewing classified reports in my office at Langley when my phone buzzed with Maple Ridge Elementary's number. Principal Henderson's voice carried that particular blend of authority and condescension that immediately put me on edge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miss Delacroix, we need you to come in immediately. Sophia has been involved in a serious altercation, and frankly, her behavior today was completely unacceptable. We're suspending her for the remainder of the week, and depending on how this meeting goes, we may be looking at more serious disciplinary action. My daughter Sophia, 8 years old, honor roll student, the child who cried when she accidentally stepped on an ant last summer. The same little girl who spent her allowance buying treats for the class hamster and wrote thank you notes to her teachers just because she felt grateful. That Sophia had apparently done something so terrible that Principal Henderson was using words like serious disciplinary action. "What happened?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "I think it's better we discuss this in person. How quickly can you get here?" 32 minutes later, I sat in Principal Henderson's office, watching him arrange papers on his desk like evidence in a trial. The man had always struck me as someone who enjoyed his authority a little too much, the type who became a school administrator because he craved control over people who couldn't fight back. His office walls displayed certificates and awards that seemed designed more for intimidation than inspiration. "Miss Delacroix, let me be direct. Sophia physically assaulted another student today during lunch recess. Tyler Morrison required medical attention, and his parents are understandably upset." The words hit me like ice water. My daughter, who wouldn't hurt a fly, had apparently hurt another child badly enough to need medical attention. Something was very wrong with this picture. Where is Sophia now? She's waiting outside the nurse's office, but before you speak with her, I need you to understand the severity of what happened. Tyler has a bloody nose, scratches on his arms, and his shirt was torn. 3 witnesses saw Sophia attack him unprovoked near the playground equipment. I studied Henderson's face, noting the satisfied way he delivered this information. In my profession, reading people is a survival skill, and everything about his demeanor suggested there was more to this story than he was telling. "I'd like to hear Sophia's version of events." "Of course, but I want you to prepare yourself. Children sometimes fabricate stories when they're caught doing something wrong. Sophia's account of what happened is, frankly, difficult to believe." Henderson led me through the hallway to where Sophia sat on a small chair outside the nurse's office. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her school uniform dirty, and there was a small scrape on her left knee. But what broke my heart was her expression. My confident, cheerful daughter looked small and defeated, her green eyes red from crying. "Mommy?" She looked up when she saw me, and the relief in her voice was heartbreaking. I knelt beside her chair, ignoring Henderson's presence, and gently took her hands in mine. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what happened today?" "Tyler and his friends cornered me by the monkey bars during lunch. They were saying mean things about you, calling you names because you travel for work. When I told them to stop, Tyler pushed me down and said his dad told him that women like you don't belong in important jobs." Henderson cleared his throat impatiently. "Miss Delacroix, as I mentioned, children often embellish." I held up a hand, keeping my eyes on Sophia. "What happened next, baby?" "Tyler kicked dirt at me when I was on the ground. Then he grabbed my backpack and started going through it, throwing my books around. He found my reading journal and tore pages out of it, the pages where I wrote about being proud of my mom." Sophia's voice cracked. "I told him to give it back, but he just laughed and tore up more pages." "And then?" "He shoved me again, really hard, and I fell backwards into the fence. The metal part cut my knee." She showed me the scrape I'd noticed earlier. "That's when I got scared and pushed him back. He was bigger than me, but I pushed him as hard as I could because I wanted him to leave me alone." Henderson interjected again. "You see how she's portraying herself as the victim? Tyler's injuries are real and documented. Sophia's minor scrape hardly compares to—" "Where were the playground supervisors during this incident?" My voice carried the controlled tone I used in interrogations, calm but with an edge that suggested serious consequences for unsatisfactory answers. They were attending to other students.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The playground is large, and we can't monitor every interaction. 3 witnesses saw the altercation, you said. What exactly did they witness? Henderson shifted uncomfortably. They saw Sophia push Tyler forcefully, causing him to fall and injure himself. Did any of these witnesses see what led up to Sophia's actions? The details preceding the physical altercation are less clear. I stood slowly, my training helping me maintain composure despite the anger building inside me. So you have witnesses who saw my 8-year-old daughter defend herself after being bullied and assaulted, but you're choosing to ignore the circumstances that led to her response. Miss Delacroix, I understand you want to defend your daughter, but violence is never the answer. Sophia should have sought help from an adult rather than taking matters into her own hands. The adults weren't available to help her, apparently. Henderson's jaw tightened. I've made my decision regarding Sophia's suspension. What we need to discuss now is the potential for more serious consequences if her behavior doesn't improve dramatically. Something in his tone, the way he emphasized serious consequences, set off every alarm bell in my head. This wasn't about playground discipline. This was about power. About a man who enjoyed intimidating children and parents who couldn't fight back effectively. What kind of serious consequences? Sophia has been displaying concerning behavioral patterns this semester. Her teachers report that she asks too many questions in class, challenges instructions when she doesn't understand the reasoning behind them, and seems to think rules don't apply to her. I felt my professional training kick in, the same cold clarity that helped me navigate hostile territories and extract information from uncooperative sources. Henderson was building a case against my daughter using normal childhood curiosity and intelligence as evidence of problematic behavior. Asking questions and seeking understanding are signs of an engaged student, not behavioral problems. Not when those questions disrupt class flow and challenge teacher authority. Combined with today's violent outburst, I'm recommending that Sophia be transferred to the alternative education program. She clearly needs a more structured environment that can address her aggressive tendencies. Alternative education. The school district's program for children with serious behavioral and disciplinary issues, a place where my honor student daughter would be grouped with kids who had genuine problems, effectively ending her academic prospects before she'd even reached 4th grade. I looked at Sophia, who was listening to this conversation with growing confusion and fear. My little girl, who read 3 grades above her level and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, was being labeled as a problem child because she defended herself against a bully and asked too many questions in class. I see. I kept my voice level, giving Henderson no indication of the storm building inside me. When would this transfer take place? I'm recommending it begin next Monday. This suspension gives us time to process the paperwork and allows Sophia to reflect on her choices. Henderson was enjoying this. I could see it in his eyes, the satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the power in this situation. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I'll need copies of all documentation related to this incident and Sophia's supposed behavioral issues. Of course, my secretary can provide those for you. Henderson stood, clearly eager to conclude what he viewed as a successful meeting. I hope you understand that these decisions aren't made lightly. We have to consider the safety of all our students. Oh, I understand completely. I helped Sophia gather her torn books and damaged journal, noting how Henderson made no offer to replace the destroyed school materials. We'll be in touch very soon. As we walked to the car, Sophia's small hand gripped mine tightly. Mommy, am I really in big trouble? Am I really a bad kid like Mr. Henderson said? I stopped walking and knelt down to meet her eyes.
Sophia Claire Delacroix, you are not a bad kid. You are brave, intelligent, and you stood up for yourself when no adult was there to protect you. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise. But I'm suspended, and Tyler got hurt, and now I have to go to the bad kids' school. No, sweetheart, you're not going anywhere except home with me right now, and Mr. Henderson is about to learn something very important about what happens when you mess with the wrong family. The drive home gave me time to process what had really happened today. Tyler Morrison's father worked at the local defense contracting firm, the same company that had recently lost several government contracts to competitors. His comments about women not belonging in important jobs weren't random childhood cruelty. They were learned behavior, passed down from an adult who likely resented strong women in positions of authority. Henderson's rush to judgment, his dismissal of the circumstances leading to Sophia's actions, and his eagerness to exile her to alternative education all painted a clear picture. This wasn't about maintaining school safety or discipline. This was about teaching children to accept injustice and punishment for defending themselves, particularly if those children came from families that certain people viewed as threats to their worldview.
That evening, after Sophia was asleep, I sat in my home office surrounded by the tools of my profession. Encrypted communication devices, secure filing systems, and most importantly, a network of contacts that spanned multiple government agencies and private organizations. 23 years with the Central Intelligence Agency had taught me many things, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was this: information is power, and power used correctly can move mountains. I started with basic research. Maple Ridge Elementary Staff Directory, school board composition, recent policy changes, and budget allocations. Then I dug deeper. Henderson's employment history, disciplinary record, and any complaints filed against him by parents or teachers. The pattern that emerged was troubling but not surprising. Principal Marcus Henderson had been at Maple Ridge for 6 years. In that time, 17 families had filed formal complaints about his handling of disciplinary issues, with a notable pattern of harsher punishments being assigned to children from single-parent families, minorities, and military families. 3 teachers had requested transfers specifically citing his management style, and 2 had filed grievances with the district about his treatment of students. Most telling was the alternative education referral data. Henderson referred children to the program at a rate nearly 3 times higher than other elementary principals in the district, with the majority of those referrals coming from families without significant local political connections. Tyler Morrison's family told a different story. His father, Bradley Morrison, was a prominent local businessman whose company had recently been awarded several lucrative municipal contracts. The Morrison family had donated generously to school district fundraising campaigns, and Mrs. Morrison served on the Parent Advisory Council. Tyler had been involved in 4 documented incidents of bullying behavior over the past 2 years, yet none had resulted in suspension or alternative education referral. By midnight, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier on the situation. Henderson's pattern of discriminatory discipline, the Morrison family's influence within the school system, and the specific circumstances of today's incident that no one had bothered to investigate properly. But I needed more than just documentation. I needed leverage. Wednesday morning brought a phone call from my supervisor at Langley, Director Sarah Chen, someone who'd been both mentor and friend throughout my career. "Victoria, I heard about Sophia's situation through the grapevine. How are you holding up?" The intelligence community is smaller than most people realize, and family crises have a way of traveling through informal networks faster than official channels. Sarah's call wasn't entirely unexpected, but her timing was perfect. "I'm managing, but there's something I need to discuss with you about potential security implications." Security implications at an elementary school? I explained Henderson's pattern of targeting children from military and government families, the suspicious timing of increased scrutiny toward families with federal employment, and the potential for foreign intelligence services to exploit such systematic discrimination for recruitment purposes. "You think this is espionage-related?" "I think it's creating vulnerabilities that hostile actors could exploit."
Disaffected government employees whose children are being systematically targeted by local authority figures make excellent recruitment targets for foreign intelligence services. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. What do you need from me? Official backing for a comprehensive review of potential security risks related to discriminatory practices in local institutions that interact with federal employees and their families. You want to audit the school district? I want to audit the specific individuals and patterns that pose potential threats to federal employee welfare and security clearance integrity. Within 2 hours, I had official authorization to conduct a preliminary security assessment related to potential targeting of federal employees through their family members. It wasn't exactly standard protocol, but then again, protecting national security sometimes required creative interpretation of bureaucratic boundaries. My first stop was the school district's central administrative office, where I requested a meeting with Superintendent Dr. Patricia Walsh. The receptionist informed me that the superintendent was in meetings all day, but perhaps I could schedule something for the following week. I placed my identification on her desk. CIA credentials have a way of rearranging busy schedules very quickly. "I'll see if Dr. Walsh has a few minutes right now," the receptionist said, her voice suddenly very professional. Dr. Walsh appeared within 3 minutes, a tall woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to managing complex political situations. Her office was decorated with photos of students and community leaders, awards from various civic organizations, and certificates recognizing the district's academic achievements. "Agent Delacroix, please have a seat. I understand you're here about your daughter's situation at Maple Ridge." "I'm here about potential security risks related to systematic discrimination against federal employees and their families within your district." The superintendent's expression shifted from polite concern to focused attention. "Security risks?" I opened my briefcase and placed a folder on her desk. "My preliminary investigation has identified concerning patterns of discriminatory discipline practices, potential targeting of specific demographic groups, and administrative decisions that could compromise the security clearance status of federal employees." Dr. Walsh opened the folder and began reading. Inside were copies of Henderson's disciplinary records, comparative statistics showing the disparity in punishment between connected and unconnected families, and documentation of the systematic harassment that preceded yesterday's incident involving Sophia. Principal Henderson's referral rate to alternative education for children from federal employee families is 340% higher than the district average. His suspension rates for these same children exceed normal parameters by 280%. These patterns suggest either gross incompetence or deliberate targeting. "These are serious allegations, Agent Delacroix." "They're not allegations. They're documented statistical anomalies that pose potential national security implications. Federal employees whose children are systematically targeted by local authorities represent recruitment opportunities for hostile intelligence services." Dr. Walsh continued reading, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "What exactly are you requesting from the district?" "Immediate administrative review of all disciplinary decisions made by Principal Henderson over the past 3 years, with particular attention to cases involving federal employee families. Independent investigation of yesterday's incident involving my daughter. And implementation of oversight protocols to prevent future discriminatory practices that could compromise federal security interests." "And if the district chooses not to cooperate with these requests?" I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "Dr. Walsh, I'm not making requests. I'm informing you of a federal security assessment that will proceed with or without district cooperation. Your level of cooperation will be noted in my final report, which will be distributed to relevant agencies, including the Office of Personnel Management, the Department of Education, and potentially the Department of Homeland Security." The superintendent closed the folder and studied my face for a long moment. "What happened to your daughter was inappropriate. I can see that from these records. But a federal investigation seems like an extreme response to a school disciplinary issue. When that school disciplinary issue is part of a pattern targeting federal employees and their families, it becomes a federal matter. When a child is punished for defending herself against bullying while her attacker faces no consequences because of his family's local connections, it becomes a matter of equal justice under law." Dr. Walsh reached for her phone. I'm calling an emergency administrative review meeting for this afternoon. Principal Henderson, the school board chair, and our district legal counsel will attend. I assume you'll want to be present? I'll be there. And Dr. Walsh, I suggest you also invite someone from your media relations department. This story is going to attract attention one way or another. Better to control the narrative from the beginning. That afternoon's meeting took place in the district's main conference room, a space designed to intimidate parents with its formal atmosphere and positioning that placed administrators at the head of a long table while visitors sat in smaller chairs facing them. I chose to stand. Principal Henderson arrived looking confident, clearly believing that his superintendent would support his disciplinary decisions. School board chair Robert Martinez appeared nervous, constantly checking his phone and avoiding eye contact. District legal counsel Janet Morrison seemed prepared for battle, her briefcase bulging with what I assumed were policies and procedures designed to protect the district from liability. Dr. Walsh called the meeting to order at 3 p.m. sharp. We're here to review the disciplinary action taken against Sophia Delacroix and to address concerns about potential patterns of discriminatory enforcement within our district. Henderson leaned forward, eager to defend his position. Dr. Walsh, I appreciate Agent Delacroix's concern for her daughter, but we cannot allow federal intimidation to override our educational authority. Sophia committed an act of violence against another student. The consequences are appropriate and necessary. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed through years of interrogating hostile sources. Yesterday, you told me that 3 witnesses saw Sophia attack Tyler Morrison unprovoked. I'd like to know specifically who these witnesses were and exactly what they witnessed. Henderson glanced at his legal counsel before responding. The witnesses were other students who saw the physical altercation. Their identities are protected under student privacy policies. Were any of these witnesses interviewed individually? Were their statements documented? Was any attempt made to determine what preceded the physical contact? We conducted appropriate investigations given the circumstances. I placed a digital recorder on the conference table. Mr. Henderson, are you familiar with the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act? Of course. FERPA protects student educational records. It also provides parents with the right to access records related to their child's education, including disciplinary investigations. I'm formally requesting all documentation related to the investigation of yesterday's incident, including witness statements, surveillance footage if available, and the written reports filed by playground supervisors. Legal counsel Morrison spoke up. Some of that information may be protected under student privacy. Ms. Morrison, nothing is protected when it relates to my daughter's educational record or when it documents potential civil rights violations. Additionally, this is now part of a federal security assessment, which changes the legal parameters considerably. Dr. Walsh looked uncomfortable. Agent Delacroix, what specifically are you alleging? I opened my briefcase and distributed copies of my analysis to everyone at the table. I'm documenting systematic discrimination against federal employee families, deliberate misapplication of disciplinary policies, and potential violations of equal protection under law. Henderson's confidence began to crack as he read the statistical analysis. These numbers are taken out of context. Each case was handled individually based on specific circumstances. Mr. Henderson, explain why Tyler Morrison, who has 4 documented incidents of aggressive behavior toward other students, has never been suspended or referred to alternative education, while my daughter faces alternative education referral for defending herself in her first disciplinary incident. Silence filled the conference room. Board Chair Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Legal counsel Morrison made notes on her legal pad, and Dr. Walsh studied the documents with growing concern. Furthermore, I continued, explain why playground supervisors were unavailable to monitor the area where this incident occurred, despite district policy requiring adult supervision of all outdoor areas during recess periods. Henderson looked to his legal counsel for support. Sometimes staffing situations create gaps in coverage. It's unavoidable given budget constraints. Yet the playground was adequately supervised the previous week when Tyler Morrison was reported for throwing rocks at younger students, an incident that resulted in a verbal warning rather than suspension. Dr. Walsh set down the papers and looked directly at Henderson. Marcus, I need complete honesty here. Was the Tyler Morrison rock-throwing incident properly documented and reported to parents? Henderson's pause was telling. We handle minor incidents through informal counseling when appropriate. Throwing rocks at younger children is a minor incident? I asked. The circumstances were different. How were they different? Another pause. Tyler was playing a game. There was no malicious intent. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder I'd prepared that morning. Mr. Henderson, I have sworn statements from 3 parents whose children were targets of Tyler Morrison's games over the past 6 months. Would you like me to read them aloud? The color drained from Henderson's face. Legal counsel Morrison looked alarmed. Dr. Walsh reached for the folder with obvious concern. Additionally, I continued, I have documentation showing that Mrs. Bradley Morrison contacted you personally regarding yesterday's incident before any investigation had been conducted, and that your decision to suspend Sophia was made during that phone conversation, not after reviewing evidence or interviewing witnesses. Henderson started to speak, then stopped. Board Chair Martinez finally looked up from his phone, apparently realizing that this meeting had moved far beyond routine damage control. Dr. Walsh finished reading the parent statements and set them aside with visible frustration. Marcus, these statements describe systematic bullying behavior that was never properly addressed. How do you explain the discrepancy between these accounts and your characterization of Tyler's behavior as minor incidents? Parents sometimes exaggerate when their children come home upset. 3 separate families filed formal complaints about Tyler Morrison's behavior toward their children. Where are the files for those complaints? Henderson looked trapped. Not all complaints result in formal documentation if they can be resolved through conversation. Mr. Henderson, I interrupted, are you saying that you failed to document multiple complaints about aggressive behavior from a student whose family has significant influence in the community while simultaneously building a case for alternative education referral against my daughter based on a single incident of self-defense? The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. Finally, Dr. Walsh spoke. This meeting is suspended pending a complete administrative review of all disciplinary decisions made at Maple Ridge Elementary over the past 2 academic years. Mr. Henderson, you are suspended with pay effective immediately while this investigation proceeds. Agent Delacroix, I assume your federal assessment will continue regardless of our internal review? Dr. Walsh, my assessment will document the district's response to these issues as thoroughly as it documents the problems themselves. Cooperation and corrective action will be noted positively. Obstruction or retaliation will have different implications. As the meeting broke up, Henderson approached me with barely contained anger. You think you can waltz in here with your federal credentials and intimidate us into changing our policies? This is still a local school district with local authority. I met his gaze steadily. Mr. Henderson, you suspended my daughter for defending herself and attempted to exile her to alternative education based on fabricated behavioral concerns. You enabled systematic bullying because the bully's family has local influence while targeting children whose parents serve their country. You created a hostile environment that compromises federal employee security clearance integrity. So what? You're going to destroy my career over a playground scuffle? I'm going to ensure that no other child suffers what you put my daughter through.
Your career consequences are entirely the result of your own choices. Henderson stormed out, leaving the rest of us to discuss next steps. Dr. Walsh seemed genuinely committed to addressing the systemic issues I'd identified, but I'd learned long ago that good intentions meant nothing without enforcement mechanisms. Dr. Walsh, I'll need weekly progress reports on your internal investigation, copies of all corrective measures implemented, and assurance that no retaliation occurs against my daughter or family. Of course. And Agent Delacroix, I want you to know that if these patterns are confirmed by our investigation, there will be significant consequences beyond just Principal Henderson's situation. That evening, I sat with Sophia at our kitchen table, helping her with homework that she'd missed during her suspension. She seemed more like herself again, though I could tell the experience had shaken her confidence.
"Mommy, Tyler's mom called earlier. She sounded really angry." I looked up from the math problems we were reviewing. What did she say? She said that Tyler is upset because his dad is in trouble at work and it's somehow connected to what happened at school. She said Tyler might have to change schools. Interesting. Bradley Morrison's defense contracting company was apparently facing scrutiny related to the security clearance issues I'd raised. When federal employees' children are systematically targeted by local institutions, it creates vulnerabilities that demand investigation of all related parties. Sweetheart, none of that is your fault or your responsibility. You defended yourself when no adult was available to help you. That was brave and appropriate. But what if the other kids think I'm a tattletale or troublemaker? It was a fair concern. Children who challenge authority, even when they're right, often face social consequences from peers who've been taught to accept injustice quietly. Sophia, there will always be people who want you to stay quiet when you see something wrong. But speaking up for yourself and others is one of the most important things you can learn to do. Some people might not understand that now, but the right people will respect you for having courage. Friday brought news that the district's investigation had expanded beyond just Henderson's disciplinary practices. 3 other principals in the district showed similar patterns of discriminatory enforcement, and the school board had voted to implement comprehensive policy reforms and mandatory training for all administrative staff. More significantly, the state education department had announced a broader review of disciplinary practices across multiple districts, using the statistical analysis I'd provided as a template for identifying systematic discrimination. Henderson had been placed on administrative leave pending the completion of criminal background checks and review of his certification status. It turned out that several incidents in his previous district had raised questions about his judgment that were never properly investigated. Tyler Morrison had been transferred to a private school across town, his family apparently preferring to avoid the continued scrutiny that came with remaining at Maple Ridge. His father's company was facing a federal contract review that would likely result in significant financial consequences. But perhaps most importantly, Sophia's alternative education referral had been formally withdrawn, her suspension had been expunged from her record, and she'd been invited to participate in the district's Gifted and Talented program based on her academic performance and intellectual curiosity. Monday morning, I walked Sophia to her classroom at Maple Ridge Elementary. The interim principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, greeted us personally and assured me that new protocols were in place to prevent the kind of systematic failures that had led to our situation. Sophia's teacher, Miss Patterson, had prepared a special welcome back presentation highlighting Sophia's academic achievements and contributions to the classroom community. Several classmates approached her with drawings and notes expressing support, their parents having apparently used this situation as an opportunity to discuss standing up for what's right. As I watched my daughter settle back into her normal routine, I reflected on what this experience had taught both of us. Sophia had learned that defending yourself is not only acceptable but necessary, and that adults who truly care about children will support those who show courage in difficult situations. I had learned that federal credentials, when used appropriately and ethically, could be powerful tools for protecting not just national security, but fundamental principles of justice and equality that make our democracy strong. Principal Henderson's attempt to punish my daughter for refusing to accept bullying had backfired spectacularly. His pattern of discriminatory discipline had been exposed and dismantled. The systemic issues that allowed such abuse to continue had been addressed through policy reform and oversight implementation. Most importantly, Sophia understood that her mother would always fight for her, that standing up to injustice was worth the temporary discomfort it might cause, and that courage and integrity were values worth defending regardless of the personal cost. That evening, Sophia asked me about my work for the first time in months. "Mommy, what do you do when you travel for your job?" "I protect people, sweetheart. I gather information that helps keep our country safe and make sure that bad people can't hurt good people." "Like what you did with Mr. Henderson?" I smiled at her perceptive connection. "Exactly like what I did with Mr. Henderson. Sometimes protecting people means stopping bullies, whether they're in playgrounds or in positions of authority. Will you teach me how to do that when I get older? I'll teach you to recognize injustice and have the courage to stand up to it. The specific methods you choose will depend on what kind of person you decide to become. Sophia nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her book about veterinary medicine. My little girl was going to grow up knowing that authority figures could be wrong, that systems could be unjust, but that individuals with courage and determination could make things right. Henderson had thought he could intimidate a federal employee's child without consequences. He'd learned otherwise. The Morrison family had thought their local influence made them untouchable.
They'd discovered that federal scrutiny operates on different principles than small-town politics. But most importantly, every child at Maple Ridge Elementary had learned that adults who abuse their authority face real consequences, and that standing up for yourself and others is not only acceptable but admirable. 6 months later, the reforms implemented in our district had become a model for school systems across 3 states. Henderson never worked in education again, and the statistical analysis I developed was being used by civil rights organizations to identify similar patterns of discrimination in institutions nationwide. Sophia thrived in her new environment, her confidence restored and her natural curiosity encouraged by teachers who understood that challenging questions were signs of intelligence, not insubordination. She'd developed friendships with children who valued integrity and courage, and she'd learned to trust her own judgment about right and wrong. The phone call that started this entire situation had come at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. It had been intended to intimidate a single parent into accepting injustice quietly. Instead, it had triggered a federal investigation that dismantled systematic discrimination and protected countless children from similar abuse. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not in foreign countries or classified locations, but in elementary school conference rooms by parents who refuse to let their children be taught that bullying is acceptable if it comes from the right source. My daughter learned that defending herself was not just her right, but her responsibility. I learned that all my years of protecting national security had prepared me perfectly for protecting what mattered most, my child's future in a world where justice and courage still matter. Principal Henderson had made one critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that intimidating a federal employee's child would be a simple matter of local authority over powerless parents. He'd never considered that some parents have the training, resources, and determination to fight back effectively when their children are threatened. That was his mistake, and it cost him everything. 3 weeks after Henderson's suspension, I received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional, carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering sensitive information. "Agent Delacroix, this is Detective Raymond Park with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. We need to discuss some developments related to your daughter's school situation that have broader implications." I was in my home office, reviewing quarterly security assessments when the call came through my secure line. The fact that local law enforcement was contacting me through official CIA channels meant this conversation was about to become significantly more complicated than a school disciplinary matter. "What kind of developments, Detective Park?" "We've been investigating irregularities in the school district's financial records as part of a broader corruption inquiry. Your complaint about discriminatory practices led us to examine Principal Henderson's administrative decisions more closely. What we found suggests systematic fraud involving federal education funding." I set down my pen and gave Detective Park my full attention. Financial fraud involving federal funds meant this case had just escalated from civil rights violation to federal criminal investigation. "How does this relate to my daughter's situation?" Henderson was manipulating disciplinary statistics to qualify the district for additional federal funding targeted at schools with high rates of behavioral problems. The children being referred to alternative education weren't problem students. They were statistical padding to inflate numbers and secure grant money.
The implications hit me immediately. Sophia hadn't been targeted because Henderson disliked federal employees or because he was trying to protect Tyler Morrison. She'd been selected as a victim in a calculated scheme to defraud the federal government of education funding. How extensive is this fraud? Preliminary investigation suggests Henderson has been systematically targeting specific demographics of students for inflated disciplinary referrals over the past 4 years. The pattern you identified wasn't just discrimination, it was organized crime. Detective Park explained that the investigation had uncovered a network of administrators across 3 school districts who were coordinating their disciplinary practices to maximize federal grant eligibility. Henderson had been the primary architect of the scheme, using his position to identify children from families unlikely to challenge administrative decisions effectively. Federal employees' children were targeted because Henderson assumed parents with security clearances wouldn't risk public confrontations that might jeopardize their careers. Military families were targeted because frequent relocations meant less community connection and advocacy. Single-parent households were targeted because they had fewer resources to fight disciplinary decisions. The cold calculation behind what had happened to Sophia made me physically sick. My daughter hadn't been caught in bureaucratic incompetence or personal bias. She'd been deliberately selected as a victim in an organized conspiracy to steal taxpayer money designated for children with genuine educational needs. What do you need from me, Detective? Your documentation and analysis provided the breakthrough we needed to understand the scope of this operation. We'd like you to serve as a federal liaison for the investigation, giving your security clearance and existing knowledge of the case. Within hours, I found myself in a secure conference room at the regional FBI field office, surrounded by agents, prosecutors, and investigators from multiple agencies. The scope of Henderson's operation was staggering. Special Agent Maria Santos, the lead federal prosecutor, opened the briefing with charts showing financial flows that looked terrorist funding networks more than elementary school administration. Over 4 years, Henderson's network diverted approximately $2.3 million in federal education grants meant for schools serving genuinely at-risk populations. The money was funneled through shell consulting companies and fraudulent professional development programs. The scheme worked by artificially inflating disciplinary statistics in participating schools, making them eligible for federal grants designed to help institutions struggling with behavioral problems. The grant money was then diverted to companies owned by Henderson's associates who provided fake services while keeping most of the funding for themselves. Henderson specifically targeted children from stable families because their disciplinary referrals were unexpected and carried more statistical weight. A single referral from a high-achieving student from a federal employee family was worth 5 referrals from children with existing behavioral documentation. Agent Santos showed me a spreadsheet that made my blood run cold. Sophia's name appeared on a list titled High-Value Targets alongside the names of 43 other children from military, federal employee, and professional families. Each child was rated based on their potential value for statistical manipulation. Your daughter was rated as a Category A target because of your CIA employment, her academic record, and the lack of prior disciplinary issues. The Tyler Morrison bullying situation hadn't been coincidence, it had been orchestrated. Henderson had encouraged Tyler's aggressive behavior toward selected targets, providing him with information about their families designed to provoke confrontations. Tyler Morrison was what Henderson called a catalyst. His family's connections provided protection from consequences, while his behavior created incidents that justified disciplinary action against targeted students.
Detective Park pulled out another file. We interviewed Tyler's parents yesterday. They admitted Henderson had spoken to them multiple times about encouraging Tyler to test boundaries with certain classmates, particularly those from what he called overprotective professional families. The manipulation was even deeper than I'd imagined. Henderson had weaponized childhood bullying, turning playground conflicts into profit mechanisms for organized fraud. Children like Sophia weren't just victims of unfair discipline, they were commodities in a criminal enterprise that monetized their suffering. How many children were affected overall? Across the 3 districts involved, we've identified 127 children who were targeted for fraudulent disciplinary referrals. The psychological damage assessment is ongoing, but preliminary evaluations suggest systematic trauma that will require extensive therapeutic intervention. Agent Santos handed me a thick folder. We need your help developing a comprehensive victim assistance program. Your background in psychological operations gives you unique insight into the long-term effects of systematic institutional betrayal. As I read through the case files, patterns emerged that revealed the true sophistication of Henderson's operation. He hadn't just been inflating statistics randomly, he'd been conducting psychological warfare against children and families, using institutional authority to create trauma that served financial purposes. Children were selected based on vulnerability assessments that included family stability, parental employment patterns, and social support networks. The most stable families were targeted specifically because their children's sudden behavioral problems would carry more statistical weight with federal auditors. Henderson maintained detailed psychological profiles on targeted families. He knew which parents would fight back aggressively and which would accept institutional authority without question. Your response was actually unusual. Most federal employees chose to transfer their children rather than challenge the system. The investigation revealed that Henderson had successfully driven out dozens of families through systematic harassment disguised as educational discipline. Parents who couldn't fight effectively were worn down through escalating demands and bureaucratic obstacles until they withdrew their children from the district entirely. Each family that left represented continued funding for Henderson's network while eliminating potential witnesses to the fraudulent practices. But Henderson's operation had created unintended vulnerabilities. The same statistical manipulation that generated fraud profits had also created evidence patterns that sophisticated analysis could detect. My CIA training in data interpretation had allowed me to identify anomalies that local parents might not recognize. Your decision to document everything and approach this as a security threat rather than a personal dispute exposed the systematic nature of what was happening. Without your analysis, we might never have understood the scope of the operation. Agent Santos explained that similar schemes were being investigated in school districts across 12 states. Henderson's network had been sharing strategies and best practices for maximizing federal grant fraud through coordinated disciplinary manipulation. This represents the largest education fraud conspiracy in federal law enforcement history. The total amount stolen approaches $8 million when all connected operations are included. The personal impact on our family was devastating enough, but understanding the broader scope made me realize how many other children had suffered similar treatment. Parents who'd accepted Henderson's authority without question, families who'd been driven from the district, children whose educational futures had been damaged to generate profit for criminals. We need victim impact statements from affected families, but many parents are reluctant to participate. They're embarrassed about not recognizing what was happening or afraid of retaliation if they speak publicly. I understood their reluctance. Admitting that you'd failed to protect your child from systematic institutional abuse was emotionally devastating. Many parents blame themselves for not fighting harder or recognizing the warning signs sooner. What kind of sentences are we looking at for the participants? Federal education fraud carries maximum penalties of 20 years imprisonment per count. Henderson is facing 47 separate charges across multiple jurisdictions. His associates face similar exposure depending on their level of involvement. The investigation had uncovered a network that extended far beyond school administration. Grant consultants, educational service providers, and even some school board members had participated in the conspiracy. The scope suggested organized crime methods applied to public education funding. Henderson's operation required systematic corruption of oversight mechanisms. Multiple people in positions of trust had to actively participate in defrauding programs designed to help at-risk children. Detective Park showed me surveillance photos of Henderson meeting with associates in restaurant parking lots, exchanging envelopes and discussing what appeared to be business transactions. The images looked like drug deal documentation more than educational administration. Henderson was paranoid about electronic communication regarding the fraud aspects of his operation. Most coordination was done through face-to-face meetings and coded phone conversations. But Henderson's paranoia about electronic evidence hadn't extended to his treatment of targeted families. His communications with parents, teachers, and administrators contained extensive documentation of discriminatory practices that supported fraud charges. Your daughter's case file contained detailed planning documents showing how Henderson intended to process her through alternative education, regardless of appeal or intervention attempts. He'd mapped out responses to potential parental challenges and developed strategies for discrediting families who fought back. The psychological sophistication of Henderson's operation was disturbing. He'd studied family dynamics, parental response patterns, and institutional authority structures to maximize his ability to victimize children while avoiding detection. Henderson specifically researched CIA employee protocols for handling family security issues. He believed federal employees would prioritize clearance protection over public confrontation, making them ideal targets for sustained harassment. Agent Santos handed me another document. This is Henderson's training manual for associates in other districts. It reads like a psychological warfare textbook focused on institutional trauma infliction. Reading Henderson's manual was like examining enemy intelligence documents. He'd systematically studied methods for creating maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability of discriminatory intent. Henderson understood that children's trust in institutional authority was a vulnerability he could exploit. By systematically betraying that trust while maintaining official legitimacy, he could create lasting trauma that served his financial purposes. The manual contained detailed instructions for identifying families most likely to accept unfair treatment, techniques for escalating disciplinary actions without triggering legal challenges, and methods for discrediting parents who attempted to advocate for their children. Henderson trained associates to view targeted children as revenue sources rather than students.
The psychological distance was necessary for administrators to inflict systematic harm without emotional interference. 3 months into the federal investigation, the true scope of Henderson's impact on our community became clear. Local mental health services reported a significant increase in anxiety and depression diagnoses among children who'd attended schools within his network. Many families were seeking therapy to address institutional trauma that had lasted years. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist contracted to evaluate affected families, briefed investigators on the long-term implications of Henderson's systematic abuse. Children who experienced fraudulent disciplinary targeting show patterns consistent with institutional betrayal trauma. They've lost trust in adult authority figures and educational systems that are supposed to protect them. Sophia had been receiving counseling to address the psychological impact of her experience. Despite our successful challenge to Henderson's authority, she struggled with anxiety about school attendance and fear that other adults might similarly betray her trust. The children understand intellectually that Henderson's behavior was criminal, but emotionally they've learned that institutions can't be trusted to protect them from adult abuse. Dr. Mitchell explained that recovery from institutional betrayal trauma required extensive therapeutic intervention focused on rebuilding trust in legitimate authority while maintaining healthy skepticism about abuse. These children need to learn that questioning authority is appropriate and necessary, but that most adults in positions of responsibility are worthy of basic trust until proven otherwise. The therapeutic process was complicated by the fact that many targeted children were high achievers who'd previously trusted educational institutions completely. Henderson's betrayal had shattered their worldview in ways that would affect their relationships with authority throughout their lives. Children like Sophia, who were academically successful and socially confident before their targeting, often experience the most severe psychological impact because the betrayal contradicts their fundamental understanding of how institutions work. 4 months after the investigation began, Henderson and 6 associates were indicted on federal charges including conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, civil rights violations, and racketeering. The indictments detailed a criminal enterprise that had operated across state lines for nearly 5 years. U.S. Attorney David Chen announced the charges at a press conference that drew national media attention. The case represented the first time federal prosecutors had pursued organized crime charges against public school administrators. These defendants systematically abused their positions of trust to steal millions of dollars meant to help vulnerable children. They turned elementary schools into criminal enterprises that generated profit through child abuse. Henderson's network had become a case study in institutional corruption that extended far beyond education fraud. Congressional oversight committees announced hearings on systematic vulnerabilities in federal grant programs that enabled such extensive criminal activity. The Henderson network identified and exploited weaknesses in federal oversight mechanisms that allowed coordinated fraud to operate undetected for years across multiple jurisdictions. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Education Committee, requested detailed briefings on the investigation's findings to inform legislative responses to similar vulnerabilities in other federal programs. If criminals can systematically abuse federal education funding while traumatizing children, we need to examine whether similar vulnerabilities exist in other programs serving vulnerable populations. The Henderson case had revealed that organized crime networks were actively seeking opportunities to exploit federal social service programs, using the same sophisticated methods previously associated with tax fraud and money laundering. Criminal organizations view federal grant programs as high-value, low-risk targets because oversight mechanisms assume good faith participation by institutional recipients. 5 months into the investigation, plea negotiations began with several defendants seeking reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. The information they provided revealed additional criminal networks operating in other regions. Henderson himself refused plea negotiations, apparently believing his connections within local political networks would provide protection from federal prosecution. His confidence proved misplaced when several local officials distanced themselves publicly from his criminal activities. Henderson seems to have genuinely believed that his status as a local education leader would insulate him from federal prosecution. He apparently never understood that federal crimes carry federal consequences regardless of local political support. Detective Park explained that Henderson's refusal to cooperate was actually helping prosecutors by forcing them to develop comprehensive evidence that would expose the full scope of his operation. When defendants refuse to plea, we have to build complete cases that reveal everything. Henderson's stubbornness is ensuring that the entire network gets exposed rather than just the surface operations. The investigation had grown to include IRS Criminal Division agents examining tax fraud related to the diverted grant money, postal inspectors investigating mail fraud components, and international investigators tracking money that had been moved offshore. Henderson's operation generated so much illegal revenue that he had to develop sophisticated money laundering methods to avoid detection. Those methods created additional federal crimes and international law enforcement cooperation opportunities. 6 months after my initial confrontation with Henderson, Sophia was thriving in a completely transformed educational environment. The new principal, Dr. Amanda Foster, had implemented comprehensive reforms based on the investigation's findings. Dr. Foster understands that rebuilding trust requires systematic changes to every aspect of school administration. Discipline policies, family communication protocols, and oversight mechanisms have all been redesigned to prevent future abuse. Sophia's anxiety about school authority had gradually diminished as she experienced consistent, fair treatment from administrators who understood the importance of transparency in their decision-making. The new policies require documentation for every disciplinary decision, parent notification within specific timeframes, and independent review of any punishment more severe than verbal correction. More importantly, Sophia had learned valuable lessons about recognizing institutional abuse and advocating for herself when adults fail to meet their responsibilities. Sophia now understands that blind trust in authority is dangerous, but that healthy skepticism doesn't mean all adults are dishonest. She's learned to evaluate actions rather than accepting positions. The educational reforms implemented in response to Henderson's crimes have become a model for districts nationwide. Federal education officials were using our district's new policies as templates for grant requirements in other regions. The Henderson investigation has fundamentally changed how federal education oversight operates. Grant recipients now face much more rigorous monitoring designed to detect statistical manipulation and systematic abuse. 7 months after the investigation began, Henderson's trial commenced in federal district court. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud, civil rights violations, and organized criminal activity that had victimized dozens of families. My testimony as the parent who'd exposed Henderson's operation lasted 3 days. I described the systematic discrimination Sophia had experienced, the investigative process that revealed broader criminal activity, and the psychological impact on targeted families. Agent Delacroix's professional training enabled her to recognize patterns that other parents missed. Her decision to document everything and pursue federal involvement was crucial to exposing the scope of Henderson's criminal enterprise. The prosecution used my statistical analysis to demonstrate how Henderson had deliberately targeted specific demographics of children for fraudulent disciplinary referrals that generated federal grant money. The evidence shows systematic selection of victims based on vulnerability assessments designed to maximize revenue while minimizing detection risk. Henderson's defense attorneys attempted to portray him as a dedicated educator who'd made administrative mistakes rather than criminal choices.
Their strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented recordings of Henderson discussing revenue targets and victim selection strategies with associates. The defendant's own words demonstrate clear criminal intent and systematic planning rather than administrative error or poor judgment. Testimony from other targeted families revealed the psychological warfare methods Henderson had employed to maintain control over his victims while generating criminal profits. Henderson deliberately inflicted maximum psychological trauma on children because traumatized families were less likely to challenge his authority or investigate his methods. The trial lasted 6 weeks and included testimony from educational experts, federal agents, victimized families, and Henderson's criminal associates who'd accepted plea agreements. The evidence demonstrates that Henderson operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise disguised as public education administration. His methods were calculated, systematic, and designed to maximize harm to vulnerable children. Henderson was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His associates received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, depending on their level of involvement. The sentences reflect the severity of betraying public trust while victimizing children for personal profit. These crimes represent fundamental violations of the social contract that protects vulnerable populations. Judge Rebecca Martinez explained during sentencing that Henderson's crimes had damaged not just individual families, but public confidence in educational institutions that serve entire communities. The defendant's actions poisoned the relationship between families and schools in ways that will require years to repair. His crimes extended far beyond financial fraud to include systematic child abuse disguised as educational discipline. Henderson showed no remorse during sentencing, apparently still believing he'd been unfairly targeted by federal authorities for what he characterized as standard administrative practices. The defendant's complete lack of accountability demonstrates the psychological distance required to victimize children systematically. His inability to acknowledge wrongdoing suggests high probability of recidivism if given future opportunities. 8 months after my initial confrontation with Henderson, the broader implications of his case continued to ripple through educational policy at state and federal levels. Congressional hearings on systematic vulnerabilities in federal grant programs had resulted in comprehensive reform legislation requiring enhanced oversight and victim protection protocols for all federally funded social service programs. The Henderson case revealed that criminals view federal social service programs as attractive targets because traditional law enforcement focuses on private sector crime rather than institutional abuse. New federal regulations required statistical auditing of all disciplinary data from grant recipients, mandatory reporting of unusual demographic patterns in school discipline, and independent oversight of alternative education referrals. These reforms will make it virtually impossible for future Henderson-type operations to function undetected.
the statistical manipulation required for grant fraud will trigger automatic federal investigation. More importantly, the reforms included comprehensive victim protection protocols designed to support families who challenge institutional abuse while protecting them from retaliation. Families now have clear federal protections when reporting systematic discrimination or abuse by educational institutions receiving federal funding. The Henderson investigation had also catalyzed broader examinations of institutional abuse in other sectors. Healthcare fraud investigators were adapting my statistical analysis methods to identify systematic patient abuse designed to generate insurance payments. The psychological warfare methods Henderson employed against families appear in other institutional settings where vulnerable populations depend on trusted authority figures. Federal social service agencies were implementing similar oversight protocols to detect systematic abuse of beneficiaries by organizations contracted to provide services to at-risk populations. Henderson's operation demonstrated that criminals will exploit any institutional setting where they can abuse vulnerable people while maintaining legitimate cover for their activities. 9 months after Henderson's conviction, Sophia had completely recovered from the psychological trauma of his systematic abuse. Her confidence in educational institutions had been restored through consistent positive experiences with reformed administrative policies. Sophia now serves as a peer mentor for other children who've experienced institutional abuse. She helps them understand that bad adults don't represent all authority figures and that speaking up about abuse is both appropriate and necessary. Dr. Mitchell, the child psychologist who'd been treating affected families, reported that most victims were recovering successfully when provided with appropriate therapeutic support and institutional environments that prioritize transparency and accountability. Children are remarkably resilient when they understand that abuse was the exception rather than the rule, and when they see that adults are willing to take corrective action to protect them from future harm. The therapeutic process had taught Sophia valuable life skills about recognizing manipulation, advocating for herself appropriately, and maintaining healthy relationships with legitimate authority figures. Sophia has learned to evaluate adults based on their actions rather than their positions, which will serve her well throughout her life in various institutional settings. More significantly, Sophia had developed a strong sense of social justice and commitment to protecting other children from abuse. Her experience with institutional betrayal had motivated her to become an advocate for vulnerable populations. Children who successfully recover from institutional abuse often become powerful advocates for systemic reform because they understand both the impact of abuse and the importance of prevention. 1 year after the Henderson investigation began, our community had been fundamentally transformed by the reforms implemented in response to his crimes. The school district had become a national model for educational administration that prioritized transparency, accountability, and family partnership. The district's new policies create multiple oversight mechanisms that make systematic abuse virtually impossible while maintaining administrative efficiency and educational quality. Federal educational officials regularly visited our district to study reform implementation methods that could be adapted in other regions facing similar institutional challenges. The Henderson case study has become required training material for federal grant administrators, educational oversight personnel, and law enforcement officers specializing in institutional abuse cases. The investigation had also generated significant financial recovery for victimized families through civil litigation against Henderson, his associates, and institutions that had failed to provide adequate oversight of their criminal activities. Families received compensation not just for direct financial harm, but for psychological trauma inflicted on their children through systematic institutional abuse. More importantly, the comprehensive reforms had created institutional safeguards that would protect future generations of children from similar systematic abuse by authority figures in positions of trust. Henderson's crimes resulted in fundamental changes to federal oversight that extend far beyond education to include all federally funded programs serving vulnerable populations. The personal journey that began with a phone call about playground discipline had evolved into a federal investigation that exposed systematic criminal activity victimizing dozens of families across multiple states. Agent Delacroix's refusal to accept Henderson's authority without question, combined with her professional training in recognizing systemic threats, was crucial to exposing the scope of criminal activity operating under cover of educational administration. My daughter had been targeted as a victim in an organized crime operation designed to generate profit through child abuse. Henderson's mistake was selecting a family with the training, resources, and determination to fight back effectively when institutional authority was abused. The Henderson case demonstrates that protecting children from institutional abuse requires parents who understand their rights, document everything carefully, and pursue federal involvement when local authorities fail to provide adequate protection. Sophia's experience had taught her that challenging authority when it operates unjustly is not just appropriate but necessary for maintaining democratic institutions that serve rather than exploit vulnerable populations. Children who learn to recognize and resist institutional abuse become adults who protect others from similar victimization. Sophia's experience will make her a powerful advocate for justice throughout her life. 2 years after Henderson's conviction, Sophia entered middle school as a confident, academically successful student who understood both the importance of respecting legitimate authority and the necessity of challenging abuse when it occurs. Sophia's experience with institutional betrayal and recovery has given her wisdom beyond her years about human nature and institutional dynamics. She understands that most adults are trustworthy, but that vigilance is necessary to protect against those who abuse positions of trust. Henderson remained in federal prison, serving his sentence while various civil lawsuits continued to hold him accountable for the financial and psychological damage he'd inflicted on victimized families. Henderson's criminal enterprise ultimately cost him his freedom, his career, his reputation, and his financial assets. The short-term profits from his fraud operation resulted in life.
Agent Delacroix's investigative methods and statistical analysis techniques have become standard tools for detecting systematic institutional abuse across multiple federal programs serving vulnerable populations. The experience had reinforced my understanding that protecting national security sometimes requires defending democratic institutions at the most local level, ensuring that positions of trust serve public rather than private interests. The Henderson case demonstrated that institutional corruption represents a fundamental threat to democratic governance because it teaches citizens that authority serves private interests rather than public welfare. Sophia's successful recovery and advocacy for other victimized children had shown that institutional betrayal, when properly addressed, could strengthen rather than weaken commitment to democratic values and social justice. Children who experience institutional abuse but receive appropriate support often become the most effective advocates for systematic reform because they understand both the importance of institutional trust and the necessity of preventing its abuse. The investigation that began with a single phone call about school discipline had evolved into a federal case study in institutional corruption that influenced policy development at the highest levels of government. The Henderson investigation revealed vulnerabilities in federal oversight that extended far beyond education to include systematic weaknesses in all programs designed to serve vulnerable populations. My daughter's courage in defending herself against bullying had ultimately protected dozens of other children from systematic abuse, while catalyzing reforms that would prevent similar crimes for generations. Sophia's refusal to accept bullying quietly, combined with her mother's professional training and determination to seek justice, exposed a criminal enterprise that might otherwise have continued victimizing families indefinitely. Henderson had thought he could intimidate federal employees into accepting institutional abuse of their children. He'd learned that some parents have the training, resources, and determination to pursue justice regardless of personal cost. The Henderson case serves as a permanent reminder that institutional authority without accountability inevitably leads to abuse, and that protecting children from such abuse requires adults willing to challenge systems that fail to serve their stated purposes. 5 years had passed since Henderson's conviction when I received an unexpected call that brought the entire experience full circle. The voice belonged to Dr. Amanda Foster, who had become superintendent of our district after successfully implementing the comprehensive reforms that emerged from the investigation. Victoria, I hope you have a few minutes. I'm calling with some remarkable news about the long-term impact of everything that happened with Henderson. I was in my office at Langley reviewing intelligence reports on emerging threats to federal infrastructure when Dr. Foster's call came through. The timing seemed almost prophetic, as I'd been analyzing systematic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors seeking to undermine American institutions from within. What kind of news, Amanda? The reforms we implemented after Henderson's conviction have been adopted by school districts in 37 states. But more importantly, we're seeing measurable improvements in educational outcomes for children from all demographic groups, particularly those who were historically targeted by discriminatory practices. Dr. Foster explained that the comprehensive oversight mechanisms designed to prevent systematic abuse had created unexpected benefits for educational quality overall. When administrators couldn't manipulate statistics through fraudulent discipline, they were forced to address actual educational challenges through legitimate methods. Achievement gaps that had persisted for decades are closing rapidly in districts that implemented our reform model. It turns out that systematic discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was educationally counterproductive. The statistical evidence was compelling. Districts using the reformed oversight protocols showed significant improvements in graduation rates, college enrollment, and long-term educational achievement across all student populations. When schools can't inflate disciplinary statistics to access federal grants, they have to focus on actual educational excellence to secure funding. The quality improvements have been extraordinary. More significantly, the psychological benefits for children in reformed educational environments were measurable through reduced anxiety, increased trust in institutional authority, and improved willingness to advocate for themselves when facing unfair treatment. Children in districts with transparent oversight show much higher levels of confidence in reporting problems and seeking help from adults. They understand that institutions are accountable to them rather than the reverse. Dr. Foster's call had been prompted by a request from the Department of Education to document the long-term outcomes of the Henderson case reforms for potential national implementation. The success in our district had attracted attention from federal policymakers seeking systematic solutions to institutional abuse. The department wants to use our experience as a model for comprehensive reform of federal oversight across all programs serving vulnerable populations. Your initial investigation has catalyzed changes that extend far beyond education. 3 months later, I found myself testifying before Congress about institutional vulnerabilities that enabled systematic abuse of federal programs. The hearing room was packed with representatives from advocacy organizations, federal agency administrators, and journalists covering what had become a national conversation about accountability. Senator Patricia Williams, who had chaired the original oversight hearings about Henderson's crimes, opened the session with remarks about the broader implications of systematic institutional abuse. The Henderson case revealed that criminal networks actively seek opportunities to exploit federal programs designed to help vulnerable populations. We need comprehensive reforms to prevent similar abuse across all federal agencies. My testimony focused on the systematic methods used by criminals to identify and exploit institutional vulnerabilities, the psychological impact of institutional betrayal on victims, and the oversight mechanisms necessary to prevent future abuse. Criminals who target federal programs understand that systematic abuse can operate for years without detection if it's disguised as legitimate administrative activity. Prevention requires comprehensive oversight designed specifically to identify statistical patterns that indicate criminal activity. Committee members asked detailed questions about the investigative techniques that had exposed Henderson's operation and their potential application to other federal programs serving vulnerable populations. Agent Delacroix, your statistical analysis revealed patterns that traditional oversight had missed entirely. How can federal agencies adapt these methods to identify systematic abuse before it reaches the scale of Henderson's operation? I explained that detecting systematic institutional abuse required understanding the psychological profile of perpetrators who exploit positions of trust for criminal purposes. Henderson's operation had been sophisticated precisely because he understood both administrative systems and human psychology. Criminals who target institutional settings study their victims carefully, identifying vulnerabilities that can be exploited while maintaining plausible deniability. Detection requires equally sophisticated analysis of statistical anomalies combined with psychological assessment of administrative behavior patterns. The hearing revealed that similar operations were being investigated in healthcare systems, social service agencies, and veteran affairs programs across multiple states. Henderson's model represents a new category of organized crime that targets institutional settings where vulnerable populations depend on trusted authority figures. These operations generate enormous profits while inflicting massive psychological damage on victims. Representative Michael Torres from the House Oversight Committee asked about the broader implications of institutional betrayal for democratic governance and public trust in federal programs. When criminals systematically abuse federal programs while appearing to operate legitimately, they undermine public confidence in government more effectively than traditional external attacks. How do we address this threat? The question went to the heart of why Henderson's crimes represented more than simple fraud. Systematic abuse of institutional authority taught citizens that government programs served criminal interests rather than public welfare. Institutional betrayal trauma extends beyond individual victims to affect entire communities' willingness to trust government programs. Prevention requires not just detecting criminal activity, but maintaining transparency that allows public verification of institutional integrity. The committee's final report recommended comprehensive reform of federal oversight mechanisms based on the Henderson case analysis. The proposed changes would require statistical monitoring, psychological assessment protocols, and victim protection systems across all federally funded programs serving vulnerable populations.
6 months after the congressional hearings, President Anderson signed the Institutional Accountability and Victim Protection Act, comprehensive legislation that implemented systematic reforms designed to prevent Henderson-style criminal operations across all federal agencies. The new law required statistical auditing of all federally funded programs, mandatory reporting of unusual demographic patterns in service delivery, independent oversight of decisions affecting vulnerable populations, and comprehensive victim protection protocols for families reporting institutional abuse. This legislation ensures that federal programs serve their intended beneficiaries rather than criminal enterprises disguised as legitimate service providers. Implementation of the new oversight requirements revealed additional criminal operations in healthcare systems, immigration services, and elder care programs. The statistical analysis methods developed during the Henderson investigation had identified systematic abuse patterns across multiple institutional settings. The Henderson case provided law enforcement with new tools for detecting organized crime operations that exploit institutional settings. These methods are now standard training for federal investigators specializing in white-collar crime. More importantly, the comprehensive victim protection protocols ensured that families reporting institutional abuse received immediate support rather than retaliation from defensive bureaucracies. Families now have clear federal protections when challenging institutional authority that operates abusively. The power imbalance that enabled Henderson's operation has been systematically addressed through legal reform. Sophia, now 13 years old and thriving in middle school, had followed the national policy developments with the sophisticated understanding of someone who had experienced institutional betrayal firsthand and witnessed its systematic correction. "Mom, it's amazing how many other kids were going through the same thing we did. I'm glad speaking up helped protect so many families." Her perspective on the broader implications demonstrated the emotional resilience that came from understanding that her individual suffering had contributed to systematic reforms protecting countless other children. "I used to think what happened to me was personal, like Mr. Henderson just didn't like me. Understanding that it was part of a criminal operation actually made it easier to deal with psychologically." Dr. Mitchell, who continued providing therapeutic support to families affected by institutional abuse, explained that Sophia's response was typical of children who received comprehensive support and saw their experiences validated through systematic reform. Children who witness systematic correction of institutional abuse often develop stronger confidence in democratic institutions than those who never experience betrayal. They understand both the importance of vigilance and the effectiveness of appropriate response to corruption.
Sophia had become a peer counselor for other children experiencing institutional challenges, helping them understand the difference between legitimate authority that deserved respect and abusive authority that required resistance. She's developed extraordinary wisdom about institutional dynamics and human psychology. Her experience with both institutional betrayal and systematic correction has given her insights that will serve her throughout life. 2 years after the federal legislation passed, I received an invitation to speak at the graduation ceremony for the first class of federal investigators trained in institutional abuse detection methods developed from the Henderson case analysis. The ceremony took place at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, where a new curriculum in systematic institutional abuse investigation had become required training for agents specializing in white-collar crime, civil rights enforcement, and federal program oversight. Agent Delacroix, your investigative approach has fundamentally changed how federal law enforcement addresses systematic abuse of institutional authority. These graduates represent a new generation of investigators equipped to protect vulnerable populations from organized criminal exploitation. Director Sarah Chen, my longtime supervisor and friend, explained that the Henderson investigation had influenced CIA training protocols for identifying institutional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign intelligence services. Criminal networks that systematically abuse domestic institutions create the same vulnerabilities that hostile foreign actors seek to exploit for intelligence or influence operations. The methods developed from this case have applications far beyond domestic law enforcement. The graduation ceremony included testimonials from families whose children had been protected from institutional abuse through early intervention by investigators trained in Henderson case methods. These new investigation techniques have prevented dozens of systematic abuse operations from reaching the scale of Henderson's crimes. Early detection protects both individual victims and institutional integrity. More significantly, the comprehensive oversight mechanisms had deterrent effects that reduced criminal targeting of institutional settings serving vulnerable populations. Criminal networks understand that systematic abuse of federal programs now triggers immediate investigation by specialized federal agents trained to recognize statistical patterns indicating organized criminal activity. 3 years after federal implementation of the Henderson case reforms, Sophia entered high school as a confident, academically successful young woman who had channeled her experience with institutional challenges into a passion for social justice and public policy. Her freshman year research project examined the effectiveness of institutional accountability measures in preventing systematic abuse across different sectors of public service. Sophia's project demonstrated sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics and statistical analysis that rivals graduate-level research. Her personal experience provides unique insight into both the impact of institutional abuse and the effectiveness of systematic correction. The research revealed that institutional accountability measures were most effective when they included victim protection protocols, statistical monitoring, and independent oversight mechanisms that operated transparently rather than defensively. Reform efforts that prioritize institutional reputation over victim protection often fail because they don't address the fundamental power imbalances that enable systematic abuse. Sophia's analysis had identified additional institutional settings where Henderson-style criminal operations could develop, including youth sports organizations, religious institutions, and private educational facilities that receive federal funding. Criminal networks study successful operations and adapt their methods to different institutional contexts. Preventing future abuse requires understanding how these adaptations work and developing oversight mechanisms accordingly. Her recommendations for expanded oversight protocols were forwarded to federal agencies responsible for monitoring institutions serving vulnerable populations in various settings. Sophia's research demonstrates how victims of institutional abuse can become powerful advocates for systematic reform when they receive appropriate support and see their experiences validated through policy development. 4 years after Henderson's conviction, Tyler Morrison, the child whose bullying behavior had been systematically encouraged as part of the criminal fraud operation, reached out to apologize for his role in Sophia's targeting. The letter arrived through official channels, having been facilitated by therapeutic programs designed to help children who had been manipulated into participating in systematic abuse operations. Dear Sophia, I know this letter is probably too late and maybe unwelcome, but I wanted you to know that I understand now how wrong everything was that happened in elementary school. Tyler's letter revealed the psychological manipulation he had experienced as a child being used as a tool in Henderson's criminal operation. His family's cooperation with systematic abuse had ultimately damaged him as much as his targeted victims. Mr. Henderson told me that testing certain kids was helping them become stronger, and that parents like your mom needed to learn that they couldn't control everything at school. I believed him because he was a grown-up in charge. The psychological sophistication of Henderson's manipulation extended to the children he used as instruments of abuse, creating complex trauma that required specialized therapeutic intervention to address appropriately. I know now that Mr. Henderson was using me to hurt other kids so he could steal money meant to help students who really needed it. I was too young to understand, but I should have known that making other kids feel bad was wrong. Tyler's letter continued with detailed acknowledgement of the specific harm he had inflicted on Sophia and other targeted children, demonstrating the comprehensive therapeutic work he had undertaken to understand his role in systematic institutional abuse. I spent 3 years in therapy learning about what really happened and how my actions affected other kids. I want you to know that I think about the kids I hurt every day, and I'm committed to making sure nothing like this happens to anyone else. Sophia's response to Tyler's apology demonstrated the emotional maturity she had developed through her own therapeutic process and her understanding of the systematic nature of institutional abuse. Tyler was a victim too, just in a different way. Henderson manipulated him into believing that hurting other kids was somehow helpful or necessary. Understanding that doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps me see the whole situation more clearly. The therapeutic resolution between Sophia and Tyler became a model for addressing the complex trauma experienced by all children affected by systematic institutional abuse, whether as direct targets or unwilling participants. Children who were manipulated into participating in systematic abuse often experience guilt and shame that requires specialized intervention.
Healing for targeted victims is enhanced when they understand that their tormentors were also being victimized through manipulation. 5 years after the Henderson investigation began, our family participated in a documentary film examining the long-term impact of institutional betrayal and systematic reform on communities affected by organized criminal exploitation of public institutions. The film, titled Institutional Trust: From Betrayal to Reform, featured interviews with victims, investigators, policymakers, and reformed perpetrators who had participated in criminal operations before understanding their broader impact. The Henderson case represents both the vulnerability of democratic institutions to criminal exploitation and the effectiveness of comprehensive reform when implemented systematically across multiple levels of government. My interview for the documentary focused on the investigative methods that had exposed Henderson's operation and their broader application to protecting vulnerable populations from institutional abuse. Parents have both the responsibility and the capability to challenge institutional authority when it operates abusively. The key is understanding that individual resistance must be supported by systematic accountability mechanisms to be effective long-term. Sophia's interview demonstrated how children who experience institutional betrayal can develop extraordinary resilience and commitment to social justice when they receive appropriate support and see their suffering contribute to meaningful reform. What happened to me was terrible at the time, but understanding that it led to changes that protected other kids makes it feel meaningful rather than just random bad luck. The documentary's impact extended beyond entertainment to become educational material used in training programs for federal investigators, child protection specialists, and community advocates working to prevent institutional abuse. The film provides comprehensive analysis of how systematic institutional abuse develops, how it can be detected and stopped, and how communities can recover from the betrayal of institutional trust. 6 months after the documentary's release, Henderson died in federal prison from complications related to chronic health conditions exacerbated by the stress of incarceration and social isolation. His death marked the end of direct accountability for the systematic abuse he had orchestrated, but the reforms catalyzed by his crimes continued protecting vulnerable populations from similar exploitation.
Henderson's death doesn't diminish the importance of the institutional reforms that emerged from investigating his crimes. The systematic changes will continue protecting children long after individual perpetrators are gone. Sophia's response to news of Henderson's death reflected the emotional distance she had achieved through therapeutic recovery and her understanding of the broader significance of his case. "I don't feel happy that he died, but I don't feel sad either. What matters is that the changes made because of what he did will keep protecting other kids from people like him." The psychological resolution demonstrated healthy recovery from institutional betrayal trauma that focused on prevention and protection rather than personal revenge or ongoing victimization. Sophia has achieved complete emotional recovery from the institutional abuse she experienced. Her focus on protecting others and supporting systematic reform shows genuine healing rather than defensive coping. 7 years after the initial phone call that changed everything, Sophia graduated from high school with a full academic scholarship to study public policy and criminal justice at Georgetown University. Her graduation speech addressed the importance of challenging institutional authority when it operates abusively, while maintaining respect for legitimate authority that serves public rather than private interests. Democracy requires citizens who understand the difference between authority that deserves respect and power that demands resistance. My experience taught me that speaking up when something is wrong isn't disrespectful, it's essential. The scholarship she received had been established by families affected by institutional abuse who wanted to support students committed to preventing systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Sophia's academic achievement and commitment to social justice represent the best possible outcome for a child who experienced institutional betrayal. Her success demonstrates that appropriate response to abuse can strengthen rather than damage victims' faith in democratic institutions. My own career had evolved to include specialized consultation on institutional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign intelligence services seeking to undermine American democratic institutions from within. The Henderson investigation revealed that domestic criminal networks create the same vulnerabilities that foreign actors seek to exploit for intelligence or influence operations. Protecting vulnerable populations from institutional abuse is essential for national security. The methods developed during Sophia's case had become standard protocols for identifying and preventing systematic exploitation of federal programs by both domestic criminals and foreign intelligence operations. Institutional accountability mechanisms that protect vulnerable populations from criminal exploitation also protect democratic institutions from foreign manipulation. The connection between domestic abuse prevention and national security is direct and measurable. 8 years later, as Sophia began her senior year at Georgetown with plans to attend law school and specialize in civil rights enforcement, she reflected on how her childhood experience with institutional betrayal had shaped her understanding of justice and democratic governance. "What happened to me when I was 8 years old taught me that institutions are only as trustworthy as the people who run them, and that protecting vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance by citizens willing to challenge authority when it operates abusively." Her academic research continued examining institutional vulnerabilities across various sectors, contributing to policy development that strengthened accountability mechanisms protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. Sophia's work represents the next generation of institutional reform advocates who understand both the importance of systematic accountability and the methods necessary to achieve it effectively. The phone call that had begun this entire journey occurred 9 years earlier on a Tuesday afternoon when Principal Henderson informed me that my daughter was being suspended for defending herself against systematic bullying. Henderson had expected a federal employee to accept institutional authority without question, protecting my security clearance by avoiding public confrontation that might attract unwanted attention. Instead, he encountered a parent with the training, resources, and determination to expose systematic criminal activity disguised as educational administration. The Henderson case demonstrates that protecting children from institutional abuse sometimes requires parents with specialized skills and federal resources to challenge criminal operations that exploit positions of trust. Sophia's experience had catalyzed comprehensive reforms that protected thousands of children from systematic institutional abuse while strengthening democratic institutions against both domestic criminal exploitation and foreign intelligence manipulation. Individual resistance to institutional abuse, when supported by appropriate investigative resources and systematic accountability mechanisms, can generate changes that protect entire populations from systematic exploitation. The investigation that began with a single child defending herself on a playground had evolved into federal legislation protecting vulnerable populations across all government programs, comprehensive training protocols for federal investigators, and institutional accountability mechanisms that deterred criminal exploitation of positions serving public trust. Henderson's attempt to intimidate a federal employee's child into accepting systematic abuse had ultimately triggered the most comprehensive reform of federal oversight mechanisms in decades. Criminal operations that target federal employees' families underestimate both the investigative resources available to detect systematic abuse and the determination of parents willing to use those resources to protect their children. 9 years later, the reforms continued protecting vulnerable populations while the methods developed during the investigation provided law enforcement with powerful tools for detecting and preventing institutional abuse across multiple sectors. Institutional accountability mechanisms that protect vulnerable populations from criminal exploitation also protect democratic institutions from foreign manipulation. The connection between domestic abuse prevention and national security is direct and measurable. 8 years later, as Sophia began her senior year at Georgetown with plans to attend law school and specialize in civil rights enforcement, she reflected on how her childhood experience with institutional betrayal had shaped her understanding of justice and democratic governments. What happened to me when I was 8 years old taught me that institutions are only as trustworthy as the people who run them, and that protecting vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance by citizens willing to challenge authority when it operates abusively. Her academic research continued examining institutional vulnerabilities across various sectors, contributing to policy development that strengthened accountability mechanisms protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. Sophia's work represents the next generation of institutional reform advocates who understand both the importance of systematic accountability and the methods necessary to achieve it effectively. The phone call that had begun this entire journey occurred 9 years earlier on a Tuesday afternoon when Principal Henderson informed me that my daughter was being suspended for defending herself against systematic bullying. Henderson had expected a federal employee to accept institutional authority without question, protecting my security clearance by avoiding public confrontation that might attract unwanted attention. Instead, he encountered a parent with the training, resources, and determination to expose systematic criminal activity disguised as educational administration. The Henderson case demonstrates that protecting children from institutional abuse sometimes requires parents with specialized skills and federal resources to challenge criminal operations that exploit positions of trust. Sophia's experience had catalyzed comprehensive reforms that protected thousands of children from systematic